I'm Sarah, and what I'm about to tell you sounds like something out of a corporate thriller. But every word is true. It started 18 months ago, when I was working as a junior architect at Morrison & Associates in Denver, Colorado. I thought I knew who I was, where I came from, and what my future looked like. I was wrong about everything. My story begins with my mentor, David Morrison, the charismatic founder of one of Denver's most successful architectural firms. I'd been working under him for 2 years, and he'd taken me under his wing in a way that felt almost paternal. My own father had died when I was 12, and David filled that void with his guidance, his belief in my abilities, and his promise that I had a bright future at his company. You remind me of myself when I was starting out, he'd tell me during our weekly mentorship sessions. Hungry, talented, willing to do whatever it takes to succeed. He'd share stories about building his business from nothing, about the sacrifices he'd made, the risks he'd taken. I admired him deeply and worked 16-hour days trying to prove myself worthy of his investment in me. My mother, Elena Rodriguez, had raised me alone after my father's death. She worked 2 jobs to put me through architecture school and never talked much about my father's work, only that he'd been in construction, and that we'd lost everything when he died. She'd grown up in poverty in Mexico, immigrated to the US as a teenager, and viewed my success at Morrison & Associates as proof that the American dream was real. "Mija, you're living the life your father would have wanted for you," she'd say whenever I called to tell her about a project David had assigned me, or praise he'd given me. She was so proud, so hopeful about my future. It breaks my heart now to remember how happy those conversations made her. Everything changed on a random Tuesday in March. I was working late, alone in the office, when I decided to use David's computer to print a large format drawing. His machine was faster than mine, and he'd given me his password months ago for situations like this. I wasn't snooping, just trying to get my work done efficiently. While waiting for the print job to process, I noticed a folder on his desktop labeled Acquisition Files, Historical. Curiosity got the better of me. David often talked about the various companies he'd acquired over the years, small firms that he'd bought out and absorbed into Morrison & Associates. I thought it might be interesting to see how he structured these deals, maybe learn something about the business side of architecture. I opened the folder and found dozens of subfolders, each labeled with a company name and date. One caught my eye immediately. Rodriguez Construction and Design, 2011. My father's last name was Rodriguez, and 2011 was the year after he died. My hands started shaking as I clicked on the folder. Inside were documents that made my world collapse. Purchase agreements, asset transfers, intellectual property assignments, and client lists for a company called Rodriguez Construction and Design. The owner listed on all the paperwork was Miguel Rodriguez, my father's name. The business address was our old house, the one we'd lost and had to move out of after my father died. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was reading David's internal memos about the acquisition. In his own words, he described how he'd waited for Miguel Rodriguez's death, knowing the man's widow wouldn't understand the business well enough to keep it running. He'd approached my mother within months of my father's funeral, offering to help by purchasing the company's assets and client contracts for a fraction of their actual value. Subject's widow eager to liquidate quickly due to emotional distress and financial pressures, one memo read. Presented offer as charitable assistance rather than business acquisition. Target accepted without legal representation or proper valuation. I kept reading, feeling sicker with each document. My father hadn't just been in construction. He'd been the owner of a successful architectural and construction firm with major commercial clients, ongoing projects worth millions, and a reputation for innovative, sustainable building design. David had stolen it all while my mother grieved, convincing her she was lucky to get anything for what he called a failing small business with mounting debts. The most damning document was a strategic plan David had written shortly after the acquisition. In it, he outlined how he intended to use my father's client relationships, design innovations, and ongoing projects to expand Morrison Associates into new markets. Several of the company's most celebrated projects over the past decade, including the award-winning Riverside commercial complex that had made David a local celebrity, were actually based on my father's original designs. I printed everything, every document, every memo, every piece of evidence that proved David Morrison had built his empire by preying on my mother's grief and stealing my father's life's work. Then, I sat in that office until dawn, staring at the papers and trying to figure out what to do with this information. My first instinct was to confront David immediately, to demand justice for my family. But as the initial shock wore off, I realized that a direct approach would be futile. David was wealthy, well-connected, and legally protected by the contracts my mother had signed. Even if I could prove he'd taken advantage of her emotional state, the statute of limitations had long since expired. Going public would just result in a he said, she said situation where his word and reputation would carry more weight than mine. I needed a different strategy. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could about hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and business acquisition tactics. I studied how companies were dismantled and rebuilt, how key employees could be poached, how client relationships could be transferred. If David had built his success by stealing from my family, I was going to take it all back using the same ruthless methods he'd employed. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, resources, and most importantly, I needed David to never suspect what I was planning. So I did something that went against every moral instinct I had. I became his most devoted protégé. David, I've been thinking about our conversation last week about business development, I said during our next mentorship meeting. I'd love to learn more about the acquisition side of what you do. Maybe shadow you on some deals? Understand how you evaluate targets? His face lit up with pride. Sarah, I've been hoping you'd show interest in the business side. You have the vision and drive to be a real leader in this industry. Fita, not just a talented designer. Over the following months, I transformed myself into David's ideal successor. I volunteered for every assignment, worked weekends without complaint, and gradually earned access to more sensitive company information. I studied his methods, learned his weaknesses, and identified the key relationships that held his empire together. Most importantly, I began documenting everything. Every unethical practice, every corner cut on safety inspections, every client contract that violated industry standards. David Morrison might have built his reputation on my father's stolen work, but he'd maintained it through practices that ranged from questionable to outright illegal. The first phase of my plan involved reconnecting with my father's former employees and clients. Using the contact information I'd found in David's acquisition files, I spent months tracking down the people who'd worked for Rodriguez Construction and Design. Many had been forced to find new jobs when David absorbed the company, but eliminated most of the workforce. Miguel Rodriguez was the most ethical contractor I ever worked with, said James Chen, who'd been my father's project manager for 5 years. When Morrison took over, everything changed. Suddenly, it was all about cutting costs and maximizing profits, even if it meant compromising on quality or worker safety. Through James, I met other former Rodriguez employees who'd been burned by David's takeover. Engineers who'd seen their innovative designs credited to Morrison and Associates without acknowledgement. Foremen who'd been let go despite years of loyal service. Subcontractors who'd been stiffed on payments when David decided their contracts weren't worth honoring. These conversations were painful, but illuminating. My father had built his company on principles of fair dealing, environmental responsibility, and worker safety. David had destroyed that culture within months of taking over, keeping only the profitable client relationships and discarding everything else that made Rodriguez Construction and Design special. By winter, I had assembled a small but dedicated group of allies who shared my desire to see justice done. We called ourselves the Rodriguez Project. And our goal was simple: systematically dismantle David Morrison's business empire and rebuild something better in its place. The second phase involved gathering intelligence from within Morrison and Associates. My privileged position as David's protégé gave me access to confidential information about the company's financial situation, ongoing projects, and client relationships. What I discovered was that David's empire was far more fragile than it appeared from the outside. Morrison and Associates was heavily leveraged, with massive loans secured against the company's reputation and client contracts. Several major projects were behind schedule and over budget, kept afloat only by David's ability to convince clients and investors that delays were temporary. The company's financial success was largely an illusion, maintained through creative accounting and aggressive cost-cutting measures that compromised safety and quality. More damaging was what I learned about David's relationship with regulatory agencies. He'd built a network of contacts within the city planning office, building inspection department, and environmental oversight agencies, who consistently gave Morrison and Associates favorable treatment. Some of this favoritism was the result of legitimate business relationships, but much of it crossed into corruption territory. I began secretly recording conversations, copying financial documents, and building a comprehensive case against David that went far beyond his theft of my father's company. This wasn't just about getting revenge anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of corruption that had been damaging Denver's construction industry for years. The third phase was the most dangerous, actively sabotaging David's business relationships while positioning myself as an alternative. Using the relationships I'd built through the Rodriguez project, I began reaching out to Morrison and Associates' major clients with offers to handle their projects independently. I've learned everything I can from David Morrison, I'd tell potential clients during carefully orchestrated chance encounters at industry events. But I think it's time for me to start building something of my own, something that prioritizes the same values my father's company was known for. I was careful never to directly badmouth David or Morrison and Associates. Instead, I focused on presenting myself as a young architect with fresh ideas, strong ethical principles, and connections to some of the most talented construction professionals in Denver. I let the clients draw their own conclusions about whether they wanted to continue working with David's increasingly troubled company or take a chance on something new. The strategy worked better than I'd hoped. Within 6 months, I'd secured commitments from 3 major clients who were planning to leave Morrison & Associates when their current contracts expired. More importantly, I'd convinced several key employees to leave David's company and join my new firm, Rodriguez Architecture and Construction, which I'd quietly incorporated using startup funds borrowed against my father's life insurance policy. David noticed the defections, but initially attributed them to normal industry turnover. He was so confident in his position, so convinced of his own brilliance, that it never occurred to him that his most trusted protégé might be orchestrating his downfall. "Sarah, I'm disappointed to see some of our people leaving," he said during one of our meetings. "I hope you're not planning to follow them. This company needs leaders who are committed for the long term." "Of course not, David," I lied smoothly. "Morrison & Associates is my home. I'm just focused on making sure we're bringing in the right talent to replace the people we've lost." The fourth phase involved going public with everything I discovered. But rather than simply releasing the information and hoping for the best, I coordinated with investigative journalists, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement to ensure maximum impact. I'd spent months building relationships with reporters who covered Denver's construction industry, feeding them small pieces of information about questionable practices at Morrison & Associates without revealing my role in the investigation. When I finally provided them with the full documentation of David's theft from my family and his ongoing corruption, they were ready to publish a comprehensive expose. The story broke on a Thursday morning in September, exactly 18 months after I'd first discovered the truth about my father's company. The headline read, "Local architecture firm built on fraud and stolen designs." The article detailed how David Morrison had systematically acquired struggling firms through predatory practices, how he'd claimed credit for other people's innovations, and how he'd maintained his success through a network of corruption that violated numerous local and federal regulations. The response was immediate and devastating. By noon, the FBI had opened an investigation into Morrison & Associates' business practices. The city planning office announced a review of all building permits the company had received over the past decade. Several major clients issued statements distancing themselves from the company and announcing their intention to terminate existing contracts. David called me within hours of the story's publication, his voice shaking with rage and panic. "Sarah, I need you to issue a statement defending the company. Tell the press that these allegations are baseless, that the reporters have taken things out of context." "I can't do that, David," I said calmly, "because the allegations aren't baseless. They're true, and I'm the one who provided the evidence to prove it." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You? But why? I've been like a father to you. I've given you opportunities, invested in your career, treated you like family." "You stole my real father's company while my mother was grieving," I replied. "You built your entire empire on his stolen work, and then convinced me I should be grateful for the crumbs you threw my way. You want to talk about family? You destroyed mine before I was old enough to understand what I'd lost." The legal and financial consequences for David were swift and severe. The FBI investigation uncovered evidence of tax evasion, fraud, and violations of federal contracting regulations. The city revoked Morrison & Associates' business license pending a complete audit of their past projects. Banks called in loans, clients terminated contracts, and key employees fled to competitors. Within 6 months, Morrison & Associates had declared bankruptcy. David lost his company, his mansion, his reputation, and his freedom. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for fraud and corruption and ordered to pay millions in restitution to the various parties he'd defrauded over the years. But my victory came with costs I hadn't anticipated. The stress of maintaining my double life for 18 months had taken a toll on my health and relationships. I'd lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and pushed away friends who couldn't understand why I'd become so secretive and obsessed with work. More painfully, my mother struggled to process the revelation about my father's company and David's theft. She blamed herself for being naive, for trusting David when she should have sought legal counsel. Learning that she'd inadvertently helped the man who stole from our family left her devastated and depressed. "Mija, I failed your father," she said during one of our most difficult conversations. "He built something beautiful, and I just gave it away because I was scared and alone." "Mama, you were grieving and trying to survive," I replied. "David took advantage of that. The fault is his, not yours." But she struggled to forgive herself, and our relationship became strained as she withdrew into guilt and self-recrimination. The justice I'd fought so hard to achieve felt hollow when I saw how much pain it brought to the person I loved most. Rodriguez Architecture and Construction, the company I'd built from the ashes of David's empire, thrived beyond my wildest expectations. The former Rodriguez employees who joined me brought decades of experience and relationships that helped us secure major projects throughout Colorado. We specialized in sustainable construction and ethical business practices, explicitly positioning ourselves as the antithesis of what Morrison and Associates had represented. Within 2 years, we'd grown from a 5-person startup to a 50-employee firm with offices in Denver and Boulder. We won awards for our innovative designs, our commitment to environmental responsibility, and our fair treatment of workers and subcontractors. In many ways, we were fulfilling the vision my father had started before his life was cut short. But success couldn't erase the complexity of what I'd done to achieve it. I destroyed a man's life and livelihood, even though he deserved it. I deceived someone who genuinely believed he was mentoring me, even though his kindness was built on stolen foundations. I'd spent 18 months living a lie, manipulating relationships and planning destruction with a single-minded focus that sometimes scared me. The ethical questions haunted me. Was what I did justice or revenge? Was I honoring my father's memory or betraying the values he'd tried to instill in me? Had I become the same kind of ruthless person I was fighting against? These doubts were amplified by an unexpected development 3 years after David's conviction. While serving his sentence, he'd written me a letter that his lawyer forwarded to my office. In it, he expressed genuine remorse for what he'd done to my family and acknowledged that he deserved the consequences of his actions. Sarah, the letter read, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I want you to know that my respect and affection for you was real. Yes, I stole your father's company, and yes, I rationalized it by telling myself I was helping your mother. But my feelings about your talent and potential were genuine. Watching you destroy everything I built was painful, but it was also impressive. Your father would have been proud of the strategist you became, even if he might have questioned your methods. The letter forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. David Morrison wasn't a cartoon villain, but a complex person capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. He genuinely cared about my development while simultaneously profiting from my father's stolen work. His mentorship had been real, even though his foundation was built on lies. This realization didn't change my opinion about the justice of his punishment, but it complicated my feelings about the role I'd played in his downfall. I'd spent so long seeing him as a pure antagonist that I'd forgotten he was also a human being with family, friends, and dependents who were affected by his destruction. Today, 5 years after I first discovered the truth about my father's company, Rodriguez Architecture and Construction is one of Denver's most respected firms. We employ more than 100 people, work on projects across the western United States, and have established a foundation that provides scholarships for first-generation college students studying architecture and construction management. My mother has gradually emerged from her depression and now works part-time for the company, helping with community outreach and client relations. She's found purpose in sharing my father's story with young architects and contractors, emphasizing the importance of ethical business practices and the devastating consequences when those principles are abandoned. I've also reconnected with some of the relationships I damaged during my 18-month campaign against David. Friends who felt shut out during that period have gradually come to understand why I became so secretive and driven. Some romantic relationships didn't survive the stress and deception, but I've learned to be more honest about my struggles and more willing to ask for help when I need it. The success of Rodriguez Architecture and Construction has brought opportunities I never imagined. We've been featured in architectural magazines, invited to speak at industry conferences, and consulted by other firms trying to implement more ethical business practices. In some ways, the company has become a symbol of what's possible when businesses prioritize values over pure profit maximization. But I still grapple with the methods I use to achieve this success. I've spoken with therapists, ethicists, and business leaders about whether my approach was justified. The responses vary widely, from people who see me as a hero who exposed corruption and restored justice, to others who view my deception and manipulation as morally questionable regardless of the outcome. What troubles me most is how easily I adapted to living a double life, how naturally deception came to me when I was motivated by anger and a desire for justice. I worry about what that says about my character and whether I'm capable of the same ruthlessness that destroyed David if I'm ever pushed to that point again. I've tried to channel these concerns into positive action by building Rodriguez Architecture and Construction on principles of transparency, accountability, and genuine employee empowerment. We have strict policies against the kind of predatory acquisition practices David used, and we regularly undergo third-party audits to ensure we're living up to our stated values. The company has also become involved in advocacy work, supporting legislation that would strengthen protections for small businesses during merger and acquisition processes, and providing pro bono legal and business consulting for entrepreneurs who've been targeted by larger firms using questionable tactics. Recently, I've been contacted by other people who've discovered that their families or businesses were victimized by similar schemes. Some want advice on legal remedies. Others seek guidance on how to rebuild what was stolen from them. These conversations are both rewarding and painful, as they remind me of the ongoing nature of the problems I encountered with David. One particularly difficult case involved a young man whose immigrant parents had lost their restaurant to a larger chain that used tactics similar to David's approach with my mother. The family had been convinced to sell during a period of financial stress, not realizing that their location and recipes were worth far more than what they received. By the time they understood what had happened, the legal window for challenging the transaction had closed. Working with cases like these has reinforced my belief that what I did was necessary, even if the methods were ethically complex. There are systemic problems in how business acquisitions are regulated and how vulnerable people are protected from predatory practices. Sometimes conventional legal and regulatory channels aren't sufficient to address these injustices. But I've also learned that the personal cost of seeking this kind of justice can be enormous. The stress, isolation, and moral complexity of living a double life for 18 months left scars that I'm still working to heal. The relationships I damaged, the trust I violated, and the parts of myself I had to suppress in service of a larger goal all represent losses that success can't fully compensate for. If I had to do it over again, I'm not sure I would choose the same path. The outcome was positive in many ways. A corrupt businessman was held accountable, stolen assets were restored to their rightful owners, and a more ethical company was built from the ruins of a fraudulent one. But the personal price was higher than I anticipated, and the methods I used raised questions about my own character that I'm still trying to answer. What I learned is that seeking justice, even when you're clearly in the right, can transform you in unexpected ways. The skills I developed in deception, manipulation, and strategic thinking have served me well in business, but they've also made me more cynical about human nature and more calculating in my personal relationships. I've had to work consciously to maintain empathy, trust, and vulnerability in my interactions with others. The mindset that allowed me to systematically destroy David Morrison's life is one I have to actively resist in other contexts, even when I'm frustrated or feel wronged. The story of Rodriguez Architecture and Construction is ultimately one of restoration and success, but it's also a cautionary tale about the complexity of justice and the unintended consequences of seeking it through deception. My father's legacy has been restored. His innovative designs are finally receiving proper credit, and the values he represented are being carried forward through our work. But the path to that restoration required me to become someone I'm not entirely comfortable with, someone capable of sustained deception and calculated manipulation in service of a goal I believed was righteous. The challenge now is maintaining the benefits of that success while finding ways to reconnect with the parts of myself I had to suppress during that difficult period. Looking back, I realized that David Morrison and I aren't as different as I once believed. We both identified something we wanted that belonged to someone else, developed elaborate plans to take it, and justified our actions by telling ourselves we deserved what we were pursuing. The main difference is that I was seeking to restore something that had been stolen, while he was stealing something that had been legitimately earned. But the methods we used, the willingness to deceive and manipulate others in pursuit of our goals, were remarkably similar. This recognition has made me more compassionate toward David, even as I remain convinced that his punishment was deserved. It's also made me more aware of my own capacity for behavior I would normally condemn in others. The success of Rodriguez Architecture and Construction has provided a platform to advocate for more ethical business practices and stronger protections for vulnerable entrepreneurs. But it's also a constant reminder of the morally complex path that led to this success. Every award we win, every innovative project we complete, and every ethical milestone we achieve is built on a foundation that includes both justice and deception. I tell this story not to seek validation for my choices, but to illustrate the complexity of seeking justice in situations where conventional remedies are inadequate. Sometimes, the system fails to protect the innocent or hold the guilty accountable. In those cases, individuals have to decide whether to accept injustice or take matters into their own hands. The choice I made was effective but morally complex. It achieved the outcome I sought while extracting a personal cost I didn't fully anticipate. Whether it was the right choice is a question I continue to wrestle with, even as I work to ensure that the company my father started and I restored lives up to the values he believed in. 5 years later, Rodriguez Architecture and Construction stands as proof that ethical businesses can succeed, that stolen legacies can be restored, and that justice is possible even when it requires unconventional methods. But it also stands as a reminder that the pursuit of justice can transform us in ways we don't expect, and that victory often comes with costs we didn't plan to pay. The lessons I've learned from this experience continue to shape how I approach business, relationships, and moral decision-making. They've made me more strategic, but also more empathetic, more successful, but also more aware of the price that success can exact. Most importantly, they've taught me that justice and ethics aren't always aligned, and that doing the right thing sometimes requires us to become people we're not entirely comfortable being. The most challenging aspect of the past 5 years has been rebuilding my relationship with my mother, while simultaneously growing Rodriguez Architecture and Construction. Elena Rodriguez is a proud woman who doesn't easily accept help, and my success sometimes makes her feel like she's living in my shadow, rather than standing beside me as an equal partner in honoring my father's memory. Sometimes, I look around this beautiful office and think about how different things might have been if I'd been stronger back then. She told me during one of our more difficult conversations. Your father would be so proud of what you've built, but he'd also be heartbroken that I let his original company slip away so easily. I've learned that survivor's guilt is a powerful force that can persist long after the original trauma has been addressed. My mother carries the weight of decisions she made during the worst period of her life, and no amount of business success can fully lift that burden. Part of my ongoing responsibility as Rodriguez Architecture and Construction's leader is ensuring that the company serves as a source of healing rather than a reminder of past failures. This has influenced how we structure our community outreach programs. We've established partnerships with grief counseling organizations to provide free business consultation for widows and widowers who are struggling to manage inherited enterprises. We sponsor seminars on recognizing predatory business practices and maintaining accurate asset valuations during times of emotional distress. These programs help other families avoid the trap that David Morrison set for my mother, while also giving her meaningful ways to contribute to preventing similar tragedies. The legal battles surrounding David's conviction and the dissolution of Morrison & Associates continued for years longer than I'd anticipated. Federal prosecutors used our case as a foundation for investigating similar schemes throughout the region, uncovering a network of consultants, lawyers, and business brokers who specialized in identifying vulnerable small business owners and facilitating predatory acquisitions. My testimony was crucial in several related cases, forcing me to relive the trauma of discovering my father's stolen legacy repeatedly. Each court appearance required me to maintain composure while describing the calculated way David had manipulated my family. And each cross-examination felt like an attempt to portray me as vindictive rather than justice-seeking. Miss Rodriguez, isn't it true that you orchestrated this elaborate scheme not to recover stolen property, but to exact revenge on someone who rejected your romantic advances? David's defense attorney asked during one particularly brutal session. The question was designed to undermine my credibility by suggesting personal rather than financial motivations, but it also revealed how desperate they were to avoid addressing the documented evidence of David's fraud. I learned to stay focused on facts rather than emotions during these proceedings, but the experience reinforced how the legal system often victimizes people twice. First through the original crime, then through the adversarial process of seeking accountability. The financial investigation into Morrison & Associates revealed that David's theft from my family was part of a much larger pattern. Over the course of 15 years, he'd systematically targeted small firms owned by immigrants, elderly business owners, and recent widows or widowers. His methods were refined through repetition. Identify emotionally vulnerable targets, present himself as a helpful industry expert, lowball the asset valuation, and structure deals that minimized legal recourse. The total value of these fraudulent acquisitions exceeded $8 million, money that should have gone to families like mine, but instead funded David's lifestyle and business expansion. While some of these funds were eventually recovered through asset seizures and court judgments, many of the original victims never saw full restitution. The realization that my family's experience was replicated dozens of times made David's crimes feel even more heinous. Rodriguez Architecture and Construction became inadvertently involved in helping some of these other victims pursue their own forms of justice. Word spread through Denver's immigrant business community about our successful campaign against David, leading other families to contact us for advice and support. While I couldn't provide legal counsel, I could share strategies for documenting fraud, building media relationships, and navigating the complex intersection of business law and criminal prosecution. These consultations were emotionally draining, but also deeply meaningful. Each family's story added new dimensions to my understanding of how predatory business practices destroy communities, not just individual enterprises. David hadn't just stolen companies. He'd eliminated competition, reduced innovation, and concentrated economic power in ways that harmed the entire regional economy. One case that particularly affected me involved the Patel family, whose small engineering firm had been absorbed by Morrison and Associates in 2016. Ravi Patel had built his company around renewable energy consulting, specializing in solar installation for commercial buildings. David had acquired the firm ostensibly to expand Morrison and Associates' environmental services, but actually to eliminate a competitor who was undercutting his prices. After Morrison took over, they stopped bidding on the smaller projects that were our specialty, Mrs. Patel explained during our meeting. They were only interested in the big contracts where they could charge premium rates. All the affordable solar options we developed for small businesses just disappeared. This revelation helped me understand that David's impact extended far beyond the families he directly victimized. By eliminating innovative competitors and absorbing their expertise into his larger, less nimble organization, he'd actually slowed the adoption of sustainable building practices throughout the region. His crimes weren't just personal, they were environmental and social as well. The Patel case also introduced me to Dr. Amanda Foster, an economist at the University of Colorado who studied predatory acquisition practices in emerging industries. She'd been tracking the consolidation of Denver's green construction sector and had identified Morrison and Associates as a primary driver of anti-competitive behavior. What Morrison was doing represents a textbook case of acquisition for elimination, Dr. Foster explained during our initial consultation. He wasn't buying these companies to improve them or integrate their innovations. He was removing threats to his market position while appearing to expand his capabilities. Dr. Foster became an important ally in documenting the broader economic impact of David's crimes. Her research provided context that helped prosecutors demonstrate pattern behavior and intent, strengthening the case for enhanced penalties. More importantly, for my purposes, her work validated my decision to rebuild Rodriguez Architecture and Construction as an actively competitive force rather than simply absorbing my father's legacy into an existing firm. The partnership with Dr. Foster led to Rodriguez Architecture and Construction becoming a case study in ethical business rebuilding. We were featured in academic papers about restorative justice in corporate crime cases, invited to speak at business ethics conferences, and consulted by policymakers working on legislation to protect small businesses from predatory acquisitions. This visibility brought opportunities, but also unwanted attention. David's supporters, including some clients who'd benefited from his corrupt practices, began a quiet campaign to undermine Rodriguez Architecture and Construction's reputation. They spread rumors about our financial stability, questioned the quality of our work, and suggested that our success was built on vindictiveness rather than legitimate business acumen. I've heard some concerning things about Rodriguez Architecture, one potential client told me during what I thought was a routine project consultation. Some people are saying you folks are more interested in settling scores than delivering quality construction. These attacks forced me to develop thicker skin and better communication strategies. I learned to address concerns directly while redirecting conversations toward our actual track record and client references. More importantly, I realized that success in business requires not just technical competence, but also the ability to manage reputation and perception in complex social environments. The smear campaign intensified when Rodriguez Architecture and Construction began winning contracts that would have previously gone to firms in David's network. Some of these competitors had benefited from his corrupt relationships with regulatory agencies and were struggling to adapt to increased oversight and enforcement following his conviction. The most serious challenge came when we bid on the renovation of Denver's historic Union Station, a high-profile project that would establish Rodriguez Architecture and Construction as a major player in the city's commercial construction market. Our bid was technically superior and financially competitive, but the selection committee included 2 members who'd had business relationships with David Morrison. There are questions about whether Rodriguez Architecture has the experience and stability to handle a project of this magnitude. One committee member stated during the public hearing, "This firm has been in business for less than 3 years and seems to be driven more by personal agendas than professional standards." The criticism stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. Rodriguez Architecture and Construction was still a relatively young firm, and my motivations for starting it were indeed personal. However, our team included many of the same professionals who'd successfully completed major projects under my father's leadership, and our track record of on-time, on-budget delivery was already superior to most established competitors. I responded to these attacks by doubling down on transparency and accountability. We published detailed case studies of every project we'd completed, invited independent audits of our financial practices, and established an advisory board that included respected industry leaders who could vouch for our competence and integrity. The Union Station project ultimately went to a different firm, but the selection process established Rodriguez Architecture and Construction's credibility with potential clients who'd witnessed our professional response to unfair criticism. Several committee members privately acknowledged that our bid had been superior and that the decision had been influenced by political rather than technical considerations. 6 months later, we were awarded the contract for the Colorado Convention Center expansion, an even larger and more prestigious project. This victory felt particularly meaningful because it came through purely merit-based selection, with our proposal evaluated anonymously before our company name was revealed to the committee. The Convention Center project became a turning point for Rodriguez Architecture and Construction, demonstrating our capacity to handle major commercial developments while maintaining the ethical standards and innovative design approaches that distinguished us from competitors. The project also provided an opportunity to implement some of my father's unrealized concepts for sustainable, large-scale construction. Among the documents I discovered in David's files were detailed plans my father had developed for modular, energy-efficient conference facilities. These designs had been years ahead of their time, incorporating solar integration, rainwater collection, and flexible interior spaces that could be reconfigured based on usage needs. David had buried these innovations in favor of more conventional approaches that maximized short-term profits over long-term environmental benefits. Reviving my father's visionary concepts for the convention center expansion required extensive collaboration with environmental engineers, renewable energy specialists, and sustainable materials suppliers. Many of the technologies my father had envisioned were finally becoming commercially viable, allowing us to create a building that would serve as a model for environmentally responsible commercial construction. "Your father was a true pioneer," said Dr. Linda Walsh, the environmental systems engineer who helped us implement the solar integration components. "I've been working in this field for 20 years, and I've never seen design concepts from the early 2000s that were so sophisticated and forward-thinking." He was essentially designing buildings for a world that didn't exist yet. The process of bringing my father's visions to life was emotionally complex. Each technical breakthrough felt like a conversation with him across time, as if his ideas were guiding our problem-solving processes. But it was also painful to realize how much environmental progress had been lost when David buried these innovations in favor of more profitable, conventional approaches. Working on the Convention Center project also deepened my understanding of the construction industry's resistance to change and innovation. Many subcontractors and suppliers were skeptical of our sustainable approaches, viewing them as unnecessary complications that would increase costs and create scheduling challenges. "Look, Sarah, I've been installing HVAC systems for 30 years, said one veteran contractor during a heated planning meeting. "This fancy environmental stuff might sound good in theory, but when deadlines start slipping and budgets start expanding, you're going to wish you'd gone with tried and true methods." These conversations forced me to develop better skills in change management and stakeholder communication. I learned that innovation requires not just technical expertise, but also the ability to build confidence and enthusiasm among people who are naturally risk-averse. My father's designs were brilliant, but implementing them successfully required leadership capabilities that I'd had to develop through trial and error. The Convention Center project took 2 years to complete, during which Rodriguez Architecture and Construction grew from 50 employees to nearly 100. We opened a second office in Boulder and began pursuing contracts in other Colorado cities. Our reputation for innovative, ethical construction spread throughout the region, attracting talented professionals who wanted to work for a company that prioritized environmental responsibility over pure profit maximization. But success also brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. As Rodriguez Architecture and Construction became more prominent, we attracted attention from national firms that viewed us as either an acquisition target or a competitive threat. Several major corporations approached us with buyout offers that would have made me wealthy, but eliminated the company's independence and ethical focus. "Ms. Rodriguez, we're prepared to offer $45 million for full acquisition of your firm," said Marcus Thompson, a vice president from Consolidated Construction Corp., during a meeting I'd agreed to take primarily out of curiosity. "Your team would be retained, your brand would be preserved, and you'd have access to resources that would allow much faster growth than you could achieve independently." The offer was tempting from a purely financial perspective, but I knew that accepting it would essentially repeat the cycle that had destroyed my father's original company. Large corporate acquisitions almost always result in the elimination of innovative practices and ethical standards that don't maximize short-term profits. My father's vision would be absorbed into another company's portfolio and gradually diluted until nothing distinctive remained. "I appreciate the offer," I replied, "but Rodriguez Architecture and Construction isn't for sale. We're building something that can't be replicated within a larger corporate structure." These acquisition discussions continued for months, with increasingly aggressive terms and implied threats about the difficulties of competing against better-funded rivals. I realize that success in business sometimes requires defending your independence as vigorously as you pursue growth and profitability. The pressure intensified when Consolidated Construction Corp began aggressively bidding against us on major projects, often submitting proposals that seemed designed to undercut our pricing rather than win contracts profitably. They were essentially using their greater financial resources to wage economic warfare against smaller competitors, hoping to force us into financial distress that would make acquisition more attractive. "They're trying to starve us out," explained Jennifer Kim, our chief financial officer, during one of our quarterly planning sessions. "They can afford to lose money on several projects if it forces us to accept a buyout offer. We need to be very careful about which contracts we pursue and how aggressively we price our services." This competitive pressure forced Rodriguez Architecture and Construction to become more strategic and selective in our business development efforts. Instead of competing directly with Consolidated's predatory pricing, we focused on projects where our specialized expertise and ethical reputation provided competitive advantages that couldn't be easily replicated through financial resources alone. The strategy worked, but it required patience and discipline that tested my leadership abilities. There were months when our revenue declined because we'd chosen not to pursue contracts that would have compromised our principles or financial stability. During these periods, I questioned whether my commitment to ethical business practices was sustainable in an industry that often rewarded aggressive, profit-maximizing behavior. My doubts were amplified by pressure from some Rodriguez Architecture and Construction employees who wanted to compete more aggressively for larger market share. Several talented professionals left the company to join firms that offered faster advancement and higher compensation, even if those opportunities came with ethical compromises. "I respect what you're trying to build here," said Robert Chen, our former lead project manager, during his exit interview. "But I have a family to support and student loans to pay off. I can't afford to prioritize principles over career advancement." These departures were painful because they involved people I genuinely liked and respected. They also forced me to confront the reality that ethical business practices sometimes require financial sacrifices that not everyone is willing or able to make. Building a principled company isn't just about having good intentions. It's about creating compensation and advancement opportunities can compete with less scrupulous alternatives. This challenge led me to restructure Rodriguez Architecture and Construction's ownership and profit-sharing arrangements. Instead of maintaining traditional corporate hierarchy, we transitioned to a cooperative model where senior employees could earn equity stakes based on their contributions to project success and company growth. This approach aligned individual financial interests with collective ethical standards, making it easier for talented professionals to commit to our long-term vision. The cooperative transition took nearly a year to implement and required extensive legal consultation to ensure compliance with corporate governance regulations. But the results exceeded my expectations, with employee retention improving dramatically and overall project quality reaching new levels as team members developed genuine ownership mindsets. More importantly, the cooperative structure helped resolve some of the moral complexity I'd been struggling with regarding my role in David Morrison's downfall. Instead of building a traditional company where I held all the power and wealth, I'd created an organization that distributed both ownership and decision-making authority among the people who actually performed the work. "This is what your father was trying to build," my mother observed during the celebration party for our cooperative transition. "He always believed that the people who do the work should share in the benefits of success." The cooperative model also attracted attention from business schools, labor organizations, and policy researchers who were studying alternative approaches to corporate ownership and management. Rodriguez Architecture and Construction became a case study in democratic workplace organization, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that expanded our influence beyond the construction industry. Dr. Amanda Foster, the economist who'd helped document David Morrison's anti-competitive practices, began collaborating with us on research about cooperative businesses as tools for economic justice. Her work demonstrated that our approach wasn't just ethically superior, but also more resilient and adaptable than traditional corporate structures. What you've created challenges fundamental assumptions about how businesses should be organized, Dr. Foster explained during one of our research sessions. Most economists assume that concentrated ownership and hierarchical management are necessary for efficiency. But your experience suggests that democratic participation can actually enhance performance when properly implemented. This research attracted international attention, with business leaders and policymakers from several countries visiting Rodriguez Architecture and Construction to study our cooperative model. These interactions broadened my perspective on how business practices relate to larger questions about economic inequality, democratic participation, and social justice. The most meaningful validation came from other families who'd been victimized by predatory business practices. Word about our success had spread through immigrant business communities, grief counseling networks, and legal advocacy organizations, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and support groups focused on economic justice and small business protection. Seeing what you've built gives me hope that my husband's work wasn't completely lost, said Maria Santos, whose family's restaurant had been destroyed by predatory acquisition tactics, similar to David Morrison's approach. Maybe my children can still build something that honors his memory. These conversations reminded me that the personal justice I'd sought for my family had broader social implications. David Morrison's crimes weren't isolated incidents, but part of systematic problems in how business acquisitions are regulated, and how vulnerable entrepreneurs are protected from predatory practices. Rodriguez Architecture and Construction began working with legal advocacy organizations to support legislation that would strengthen disclosure requirements for business acquisitions, mandate waiting periods for deals involving recently bereaved owners, and create enforcement mechanisms for predatory pricing designed to eliminate competition. This advocacy work brought me into contact with other business leaders who'd been affected by similar crimes, including some who'd chosen different approaches to seeking justice. Not all of their strategies had been as successful as mine, and some had resulted in legal or financial consequences that made their situations worse rather than better. I tried to fight back too, explained David Park, whose technology consulting firm had been absorbed by a larger competitor through fraudulent means. But I went public too early, before I had enough evidence to prove my case. They destroyed my reputation and bankrupted me with legal fees before I could expose what they'd done. Learning about these alternative outcomes reinforced my appreciation for the strategic patience and careful planning that had made my approach successful. Justice isn't just about being right. It's about being smart, thorough, and persistent enough to overcome well-funded opposition that has every incentive to silence or discredit accusers. The advocacy work also introduced me to law enforcement professionals who were working to improve detection and prosecution of predatory business practices. These relationships helped Rodriguez Architecture and Construction develop internal policies and training programs that could help other businesses recognize and resist similar threats. 5 years after the Convention Center project's completion, Rodriguez Architecture and Construction had become one of Colorado's most respected construction firms, with annual revenues exceeding $50 million and projects spanning multiple Western states. We demonstrated that ethical business practices weren't just morally superior, but also economically viable when properly implemented and consistently maintained. The company's success had restored my father's professional legacy while creating something new that honored his values, but adapted them to contemporary challenges and opportunities. We'd proven that businesses could prioritize environmental responsibility, employee empowerment, and community benefit while still achieving financial success and competitive advantage. But the personal cost of this achievement remained complex and ongoing. The skills I developed in deception, manipulation, and strategic thinking during my campaign against David Morrison had served me well in business, but they'd also changed my fundamental approach to relationships and trust. I found myself constantly analyzing people's motivations, looking for hidden agendas, and maintaining emotional distance even with friends and romantic partners. The mindset that had allowed me to systematically destroy David's empire was difficult to turn off, even in contexts where such vigilance was unnecessary and counterproductive. "Sometimes I feel like you're studying me instead of just being with me," said James Walsh, an environmental lawyer I'd been dating for several months. "It's like you're always waiting for me to reveal some ulterior motive or hidden agenda." His observation was accurate and painful. The hypervigilance that had protected me during my undercover work had become a barrier to genuine intimacy and vulnerability. I'd become skilled at managing relationships strategically, but struggled to experience them authentically. This realization led me to seek therapy focused specifically on the psychological impact of prolonged deception and strategic manipulation. Working with Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychologist who specialized in helping people recover from traumatic experiences involving betrayal and revenge, I began to understand how my choices had affected my capacity for trust and emotional connection. What you did required you to suppress parts of your natural personality and develop skills that aren't typically necessary for healthy relationships, Dr. Kim explained during one of our sessions. The challenge now is learning when those skills are appropriate and when they're counterproductive. The therapy process was difficult because it required me to examine whether my approach to seeking justice had been worth the personal transformation it had required. I'd achieved my goals and created something meaningful, but I'd also become someone I wasn't entirely comfortable with. This internal work coincided with external recognition that brought both satisfaction and additional complexity. Rodriguez Architecture and Construction won several industry awards for innovative design and ethical business practices. I was featured in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and recognized as one of Denver's most influential young entrepreneurs. The media attention was gratifying, but also superficial, focusing on the success story while glossing over the moral complexity and personal cost of the choices that had made that success possible. Journalists wanted simple narratives about good triumphing over evil, not nuanced examinations of how seeking justice can transform the people who pursue it. Local architect builds empire from father's stolen legacy read one typical headline that reduced years of complex strategic work and ethical struggle to a theory about perseverance and family loyalty. While I appreciated the positive coverage, I worried that such simplification might encourage others to pursue similar approaches without fully understanding the risks and consequences involved. These concerns led me to be more honest in my public speaking about the psychological and relational costs of the methods I'd used. I began explicitly discussing the ways that prolonged deception had affected my personal life and the ongoing work required to maintain healthy relationships after developing skills in manipulation and strategic thinking. Seeking justice often requires us to become people we wouldn't normally choose to be. I told an audience of small business owners during a conference on entrepreneurial ethics. The question isn't whether those transformations are sometimes necessary, but whether we can find ways to limit their long-term impact on our capacity for trust and authentic connection. This more nuanced approach to discussing my experience resonated with audience members who'd faced similar moral dilemmas in their own professional and personal lives. Many people had been forced to choose between accepting injustice and using methods that compromised their preferred ethical standards, and they appreciated honest discussion about the complexity of those choices. The speaking engagements also connected me with other business leaders who'd rebuilt companies or careers after experiencing betrayal, fraud, or other forms of victimization. These relationships provided perspectives that helped me better understand my own experience within broader patterns of how people respond to systemic injustice and personal trauma. Today, 8 years after first discovering David Morrison's theft of my father's company, Rodriguez Architecture and Construction employs more than 200 people across 4 offices in Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. We've completed dozens of major projects that incorporate innovative, sustainable design approaches, and our cooperative ownership model has influenced similar transitions at other firms throughout the region. The company has also established the Miguel Rodriguez Foundation, which provides grants and technical assistance for immigrant entrepreneurs, recently bereaved business owners, and other individuals who are vulnerable to predatory business practices. The Foundation's work extends my father's legacy beyond architecture and construction into broader efforts to promote economic justice and protect vulnerable communities. My mother now serves as the Foundation's executive director, finding purpose and healing through work that helps other families avoid the trauma our family experienced. She's become a respected advocate for stronger consumer protection laws and a frequent speaker at conferences focused on immigrant entrepreneurship and grief counseling. "Your father would be so proud of everything you've built," she told me during the Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration. "But I think he'd be most proud that you found ways to help other families avoid what we went through." The Foundation's work has brought closure to some of the guilt and self-blame my mother carried about her decisions during the period following my father's death. By helping other vulnerable business owners recognize and resist predatory tactics, she's transformed her personal experience of victimization into a source of protection and empowerment for others. My relationship with James Walsh deepened as I became more skilled at managing the psychological after effects of my campaign against David Morrison. We married 3 years ago and recently welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Alina after my mother. Becoming a parent has added new dimensions to my understanding of legacy, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of the choices we make during times of crisis. "I want Elena to know the whole story about what happened with your father's company," James said during one of our conversations about family history. "Not just the heroic version, but the complicated reality of what it took to get justice and what that cost you personally. His perspective reflects our shared commitment to raising Alina with honest understanding of how moral complexity shapes real-world decision-making. We want her to understand that doing the right thing sometimes requires difficult choices that don't fit neatly into simple categories of good and evil. David Morrison was released from prison 2 years ago after serving his full sentence. According to news reports, he's moved to another state and is working in an unrelated field, having lost his professional licenses and reputation in architecture and construction. I've had no direct contact with him since our phone conversation on the day the expose was published, and I have no interest in pursuing any kind of relationship or reconciliation. Sometimes I wonder whether he's learned from his experience or simply moved on to different forms of exploitative behavior. The skills that allowed him to identify and manipulate vulnerable business owners could easily be adapted to other contexts where people are emotionally or financially desperate. But I've concluded that monitoring his activities or seeking ongoing revenge would be counterproductive for my own healing and growth. The most important lesson I've learned from this experience is that justice and healing aren't the same thing. Holding David accountable for his crimes and restoring my father's stolen legacy provided a form of justice that was necessary and meaningful. But healing from the trauma of betrayal and the psychological impact of prolonged deception required separate work that's still ongoing. Building Rodriguez Architecture and Construction into a successful, ethical business has honored my father's memory and created meaningful opportunities for hundreds of employees and their families. The cooperative ownership model has demonstrated that businesses can prioritize values over pure profit maximization while still achieving financial success. The Foundation's work has helped protect other vulnerable entrepreneurs from similar victimization, but the person who achieved these outcomes is fundamentally different from the person who started this journey 8 years ago. The skills I developed in strategic thinking, manipulation, and emotional detachment have served me well in business, but required conscious effort to manage in personal relationships. The hypervigilance that protected me during my undercover work sometimes interferes with my ability to trust and be vulnerable with people I love. Whether this transformation was worth the outcomes it achieved is a question I continue to wrestle with, especially as I consider what kind of example I want to set for Alina. I want her to understand that standing up to injustice sometimes requires courage and sacrifice. But I also want her to know that seeking revenge can extract psychological costs that persist long after the original goals have been achieved. The story of Rodriguez Architecture and Construction is ultimately one of restoration, justice, and success. But it's also a story about the complexity of moral decision-making in situations where conventional remedies are inadequate and the personal costs of seeking justice through unconventional means. In rebuilding my father's company and holding David Morrison accountable for his crimes, I discovered that the line between justice and revenge isn't always clear, and that achieving righteous goals sometimes requires becoming someone you wouldn't normally choose to be. The challenge isn't avoiding such situations entirely, but learning how to navigate them while minimizing their long-term impact on your capacity for trust, vulnerability, and authentic connection with others. 8 years later, I'm still learning how to balance the strategic mindset that made my success possible with the emotional openness that healthy relationships require. The work continues, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to honor my father's legacy while creating something new that reflects both his values and the hard-won wisdom that comes from confronting injustice in all its complexity.